Pointless. It was their favorite word, a neat little pin they used to pop any balloon of joy I ever floated. My collection of sea glass, my attempts at learning calligraphy, my insistence on baking bread from scratch when a perfectly good loaf was $2 at the store. All of it, at one time or another, had been branded with that single dismissive word, but they saved the full weight of their judgment for my greatest love, the heaviest and most beautifully useless thing I owned. It sat on my desk like a monument to a forgotten age, a hulking mass of black enamel and chrome, the Admiral KMM, my grandmother's typewriter. I'd found it in her attic after she passed, shrouded in a dusty canvas cover like a ghost. My brother, Mark, had hefted it for me. "What are you going to do with this boat anchor, Clara?" he'd grunted, his face red with effort. "It's pointless. You have a laptop." He wasn't wrong, not technically. I did have a laptop, a sleek silver thing that was silent and efficient and utterly soulless. But the Admiral had a voice. It had the satisfying clack-clack ding of progress, the smell of old ink and machine oil, the heft of real words being hammered into existence. My mother was gentler than Mark. "It's a lovely sentiment, dear," she'd said, tracing a finger over the dusty keys. "But it takes up so much space. Are you sure it's practical?" Sentiment, space, practicality. They were all just polite ways of saying the same thing. So I kept my love for it quiet, a private rebellion in the corner of my room. I'd spend hours cleaning it, carefully coaxing the type bars back into alignment, feeding it a fresh ribbon that stained my fingertips black. They thought I was just playing, tinkering with a relic. They didn't understand that I was listening. The machine had a rhythm, a history baked into its mechanics. Most of the keys struck the page with a clean, crisp report. But one, the capital Q, was different. It always felt hesitant. It didn't jam, not exactly. It would just hang for a fraction of a second before striking, as if it had to think about it. And sometimes, when I typed very fast, it would print not a Q, but a faint, almost invisible ampersand just beside it. I'd mentioned it to Mark once, and he just rolled his eyes. "It's 50 years old, Clara. It's broken. Pointless, remember?" But I knew my grandmother. She was a woman of immense precision, a bookkeeper who balanced ledgers to the penny. She wouldn't have tolerated a broken key. I was convinced it wasn't broken. It was trying to say something. Last night, while trying to unspool a particularly stubborn bit of old ribbon from the inner workings, my fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper I'd never seen before, wedged deep inside the mechanism. It was brittle with age, covered in my grandmother's perfect, looping script. It wasn't a letter or a note. It was just a list of words, a strange and nonsensical poem that made the hair on my arms stand up. Question quietly. Quell the quarrel. Find the and. I smoothed the fragile paper against my desk, my fingers tracing the elegant loops of my grandmother's handwriting. Question. Quietly. Quell the quarrel. Find the and. It wasn't a poem. It was a set of instructions. My eyes flicked from the note to the Admiral KMM. The hesitant. Q. Key. The phantom ampersand. A cold dread mingled with a thrilling jolt of adrenaline snaked up my spine. This wasn't a malfunction. It was a message. My grandmother, the meticulous bookkeeper, had left me a key. But a key to what? The quarrel? I thought of the tense holidays, the clipped phone calls, the unspoken rift between my grandmother and her sister, my great-aunt Eleanor, that had stretched on for 50 years. No one ever spoke of it, only around it, a black hole in our family history that we all tacitly agreed to ignore. The truth of that fight, and whatever it cost them, was the vulnerable thing, a story on the verge of being lost forever. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt like I was on the edge of something huge. It was a gut feeling, the kind you just can't ignore. If you want to see where this leads, and if I can actually solve this thing, make sure you like and subscribe, because this is where it all starts to unravel. I fed a fresh sheet of paper into the typewriter. My hands hovered over the keys, my breath held tight in my chest. Question, quietly. I typed the letter Q. As always, the type bar paused, a tiny metallic inhalation before it struck. I did it again. And again. On the 5th try, it happened. The faint, ghostly outline of an ampersand appeared just to the right of the Q. Find the and. I looked closer, my heart hammering. It wasn't just beside the Q, it was pointing. Pointing at the ampersand key itself, the one that shared a key with the number 7. The door to my room flew open, startling me so badly I nearly knocked over my lamp. Mark stood there, his face a thundercloud, a crumpled bill in his hand. The electricity bill is obscene, Clara, absolutely obscene. His eyes swept the room and landed on the typewriter. It was the same look he always gave it, a mixture of pity and contempt. You know what's not helping? He said, stalking over to my desk. This monstrosity. It's a museum piece. You're probably sucking up $5 worth of power every time you turn on that stupid lamp to play with it. I'm not playing, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I instinctively shielded the note with my hand. I'm figuring something out. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Figuring what out? The fastest way to waste your time? That's it. I'm done. He jabbed a finger at the Admiral. I'm listing this thing online tonight. Some hipster will probably pay $50 for it. At least then it'll be good for something. He turned to leave, dismissing me and my 50-year-old mystery in one fell swoop. The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut. He was going to sell it. He was going to sell my grandmother's voice, her secret. The quarrel she wanted quelled, the truth she wanted found, would be sold for scrap. No, I said, standing up, you can't. He just looked at me, his expression hardening. Watch me. His words hung in the air, sharp and final. But he didn't leave. He turned back, his jaw set, and a grim determination hardening his eyes. He wasn't going to list it tonight. He was going to take it now. He stalked toward the desk, his hands reaching for the Admiral. Mark, don't, I pleaded, my voice trembling. I scrambled to get between him and the desk, placing my hands flat on the typewriter's cool, black hood, as if I could physically anchor it to the spot. You don't understand. This is important. Important? He scoffed, his face inches from mine. The smell of his frustration was a sour thing in the air. It's junk, Clara. It's a 50-pound paperweight that's costing us money we don't have. He put his hands on my shoulders and shoved me aside. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a dismissal, an act of force that sent me stumbling back against my bookshelf. My books rattled. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum of panic and fury. He wrapped his arms around the typewriter, his knuckles white. I'm taking this to the garage. End of story. He grunted with the effort, lifting the heavy machine. For a moment, he had it, its weight canted awkwardly in his arms. He took a single, unstable step away from the desk, but his anger made him clumsy. His grip slipped. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the look of surprise flash across his face, the widening of his eyes as the full weight of the Admiral tilted out of his control. I lunged forward with a cry, my hands outstretched as if I could catch it, as if I could reverse the inevitable. It hit the hardwood floor with a sickening crash that was both metallic and brittle, a sound of final, irreversible violence. The impact echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the room. A spiderweb of cracks fractured the black enamel on one side. One of the type bars, the G, had sprung loose and stood straight up, like a single, accusatory finger. Mark stared down at it, his anger instantly evaporating, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed shock. Clara, I didn't mean... But I wasn't listening. I dropped to my knees beside the wreckage, my breath catching in a sob. He had broken it. He had smashed it. He had silenced her. My fingers traced the new, sharp-edged cracks in the base, and then I saw it. A piece of the heavy bottom plate, A section about the size of my palm had broken clean off. Beneath it, carved into the solid metal frame, was a shallow, hidden compartment I'd never seen. Nestled inside the cavity, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, ornate brass key. A thin, brittle ribbon tied it to a yellowed paper tag. My fingers, shaking, reached in and lifted it out. Mark took a half step forward, peering down, a confused frown on his face. I turned the tag over. There, in my grandmother's perfect, unmistakable script, was a single word. Eleanor's. A cold clarity washed over me, silencing the panic and the rage. It wasn't just a quarrel. It wasn't just a story. It was a lock, a box, a physical secret. My grandmother hadn't just left me instructions. She had left me the means. Mark's violent, thoughtless act had, in the end, given me the final answer to find the and. It was the key. I looked from the key in my hand to Mark's stunned face, and then back to the broken machine that had given up its last secret. He hadn't ended the story. He had just forced me to begin it. I stood up, the small key clutched tight in my fist. There was nothing left for me here. What? What is that? Mark's voice was a hoarse whisper, breaking the spell. He took a tentative step closer, his face a mess of confusion and guilt. I didn't answer him. I didn't even look at him. My gaze was fixed on the tiny, intricate key in my hand, the yellowed tag a silent testament to a 50-year-old secret. Eleanor's. The name was a destination, a purpose. I closed my fist around the key, its sharp edges digging into my palm, grounding me. I walked past him, my movements stiff and automatic, heading for the door. I needed to go. Now. Clara, wait! His hand shot out, grabbing my arm. It wasn't rough this time, but the touch still felt like a violation. Where are you going? Don't be crazy. We need to talk about this. Let go of me, Mark, I said, my voice dangerously low. Not until you tell me what's going on, he insisted, his grip tightening. He was blocking the doorway, a human barrier between me and the truth. You're acting insane. It's a key from a broken piece of junk. You broke it, I hissed, yanking my arm free. You pushed me and you broke it. Get out of my way. No. He stood his ground, crossing his arms. You're not leaving until you calm down. That was it. The final snap. The utter blindness to what he had done. The casual assertion of his control over me. My hands were shaking, not with fear anymore, but with a pure, distilled rage. I pulled my phone from my back pocket. His face changed. What are you doing? I'm calling the police, I said, my thumb hovering over the numbers. He actually laughed, a short, incredulous bark. You're calling the cops? On me? For what? Accidentally dropping a typewriter? For assault, I said, the word tasting like metal in my mouth. For destruction of property, now for the last time, get out of my way. He didn't move. He just stared, daring me. My thumb pressed the screen. The two officers who showed up looked profoundly unimpressed. One was older, with a weary gut that strained the buttons of his uniform. The other was younger, a woman with a severe haircut and impatient eyes. They stood in the doorway of my room, surveying the scene, the shattered typewriter on the floor, my tear-streaked face, Mark's defensive posture. Okay, what's the problem here? The man asked, his voice thick with boredom. I took a shaky breath. My brother and I had an argument. He got angry. He pushed me and he deliberately destroyed my property. I pointed at the Admiral's corpse on the floor. Mark immediately jumped in. It was an accident. I was just trying to move it to the garage for her. It slipped. And I didn't push her. I just moved her out of the way. The male officer looked from the typewriter to me, a flicker of something, pity, condescension, in his eyes. Ma'am, you're saying you want to file a report because your brother dropped this? He nudged the broken casing with the toe of his boot. He shoved me first. He was trying to take it from me. I insisted. my voice rising with frustration. I felt my credibility slipping away with every word. They weren't seeing a crime. They were seeing a family spat a hysterical sister. "Did he hit you? Do you have any marks?" the woman asked, her tone clinical. "No, but—" "So it's a domestic dispute," the man cut in, already turning to leave. "He said it was an accident. Your brother and sister. You need to learn to sort these things out without getting us involved." He spoke to me, but his eyes were on Mark, a silent man-to-man look of understanding that made my stomach churn. A cold dread washed over me. This was my appeal to authority. This was the system. And it saw me as a nuisance. My fear, my violation, the violent end of my grandmother's legacy. It was all dismissed as a childish overreaction. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. "We're not going to file a report for a broken antique, miss," the female officer said, her voice softening just enough to be patronizing. "Just try to keep the noise down." They left. The front door clicked shut, and the silence they left behind was heavier than the typewriter itself. Mark wouldn't look at me, his face pale with shame or relief. I couldn't tell. It didn't matter. I walked to my closet, grabbed my jacket and purse, and shoved my feet into my shoes. The key was a hard lump in my pocket. I walked to the door of my room, where he was still standing. This time he stepped aside. "Clara," he started, his voice cracking. "I am sorry." "No, you're not," I said, not even looking at him as I brushed past. "You're just sorry you got caught." I didn't wait for a reply. I walked out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the cool night air. The click of the closing door behind me, the only goodbye I needed. I didn't know where Eleanor lived, but I knew who would. And for the first time, I was grateful for my mother's insistence on keeping a dusty, pointless address book. The bus ride was a blur of streetlights and smeared reflections. Each bump and sway of the vehicle was a physical reminder of my own unsteadiness. The police officers' dismissive faces were burned into my mind, their casual condescension a heavier blow than Mark's shove. I wasn't a victim. I was a nuisance. My truth wasn't a fact. It was a story they didn't want to hear. I was alone in this. Utterly. The realization didn't feel sad. It felt cold and hard, like the brass key in my pocket. It was a foundation. My phone buzzed. Mark's name lit up the screen. I silenced it. A minute later, it buzzed again. Mom. I silenced that one too. I knew exactly what was happening. He was getting ahead of the story, painting me as the hysterical, irrational sister who flew off the handle over a broken toy. He would twist his violence into my instability. He was salting the earth, making sure no help would grow for me there. It was a new kind of violation, an invasion of the one place I was running to. When I got to my mother's house, the porch light was on, and I could see her silhouette through the sheer curtains of the front window. She was waiting for me. She opened the door before I could even knock, her face a mask of anxious concern. "Clara, thank God." Mark called. He was so worried. "He said you just ran out." "He feels terrible about the typewriter, honey, just terrible." Her words were a soft, suffocating blanket. She was already trying to smooth it all over, to make it a simple misunderstanding. She reached for me, to hug me, to pull me back into the family narrative, where Mark was clumsy but well-meaning, and I was just a little too sensitive. I stepped back, out of her reach. "I need the address book, Mom." Her face fell. The practiced look of maternal worry flickered, replaced by genuine confusion and a hint of fear. "What? Clara, what are you talking about? Come inside. Let's have some tea and you can tell me what this is all about." "I don't want tea. I need Eleanor's address," I said, my voice flat. I walked past her into the familiar living room, my eyes landing on the old secretary desk in the corner. That's where she kept it. The dusty, leather-bound book filled with the names of people she hadn't spoken to in years. Another one of her pointless treasures. Eleanor? My mother's voice was sharp now. She closed the door and followed me, her slippers whispering against the rug. "Why on earth would you need to see Eleanor? Clara, stop this." Mark said you were acting strangely, that you've become obsessed with that old machine. It's broken. It's over. Let it go. I pulled at the desk's roll-top cover. It was stuck, as always. I rattled it hard, a surge of adrenaline, making my movements jerky. He didn't just break it. He assaulted me. He tried to control me, and when I wouldn't let him, he used force, and you're worried about him. That's not fair, she cried, her hands fluttering at her sides. He's your brother. He loves you. You're blowing this all out of proportion. The roll top finally gave way with a loud groan. I saw the spine of the address book and reached for it. My mother got there first, slamming her hand down on top of it. Her eyes, so often filled with gentle pity for my eccentricities, were now blazing with a desperate command. No, she said, her voice trembling, I won't let you. You don't go digging up things that were buried for a reason. You will only cause more pain, for everyone. I looked at her hand, pressed firmly on the book. I thought of Mark's hands on my shoulders, shoving me. I thought of the police officers, dismissive gestures. A world of people telling me no, telling me to stop, telling me my quest was pointless. I didn't shove her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked her in the eye and placed my hand over hers. Grandma didn't think so, I said, my voice quiet and clear. She left me a key. I slid the book out from under her palm. Her hand fell away as if my words had burned her. She just stared at me, speechless, as I flipped through the brittle pages. S. Scott. Shaw. Sinclair. There it was, Eleanor Sinclair, an address in a quiet, older part of the city. I pulled out my phone, took a picture of the entry, and slid the book back into its slot. I turned and walked back to the front door, the key in my pocket suddenly feeling heavier, more real. My mother hadn't moved. She just stood by the desk, a sentinel guarding a history I was no longer a part of. Clara, please, she whispered as my hand touched the doorknob. Don't. The plea was no longer about a family spat. It was about Eleanor. It was about the quarrel, and in her fear I heard the confirmation I needed. The secret was real, and it was waiting. I have to, I said, and stepped out into the night, leaving her alone with all the ghosts she was trying so desperately to protect. The taxi's meter ticked over with an indifferent chirp, each jump in the fare a small price for this final leg of the journey. I watched the unfamiliar neighborhood slide by, the houses growing older, more settled, their porches heavy with the weight of decades. Mark had called twice more, my mother, 4 times. I ignored them all. Their voices were part of the world I was leaving behind, a world where I was a problem to be managed. Here, in the anonymous dark of the cab, I was just a woman with a key and a destination. The address led me to a street I never knew existed, lined with enormous oak trees that formed a dense canopy overhead. The houses were set far back from the road, sleeping lions of brick and weathered siding. Eleanor's house was the quietest of them all, a modest 2-story home with dark green shutters and a porch that sagged just slightly on one side. A single dim light glowed from a downstairs window. The garden was a tangle of overgrown rose bushes, their thorns like rusty barbed wire in the moonlight. This was a house that had been holding its breath for a very long time. I paid the driver and walked up the cracked flagstone path, the sound of my own footsteps unnaturally loud in the stillness. My heart wasn't hammering anymore. It was beating with a slow, heavy deliberation, a rhythm that matched the purpose I now felt. This was it, the end of the line. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound echoing flatly against the old wood. Seconds stretched into a minute. I was about to knock again when a bolt slid back with a sharp metallic groan. The door opened a few inches, held fast by a brass chain. In the sliver of space, a face peered out. It was a woman's face, etched with the fine lines of age, but her eyes, even in the dim light, were startlingly sharp and clear. "What do you want?" Her voice was raspy, unused. "Are you Eleanor Sinclair?" I asked. The eyes narrowed. She didn't answer my question. "You have your grandmother's eyes," she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation. "What do you want, child?" I came about the quarrel, I said, my voice steady, the one she wanted quelled. A flicker of something, shock, pain, anger, crossed her features. The face disappeared for a moment, and I heard the chain rattle as she unhooked it. The door swung open. She stood there fully now, a tall, straight-backed woman in a simple housecoat, her white hair pulled into a severe bun. She looked at me as if I were a ghost she had been dreading for half a century. "That door was closed 50 years ago," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You should have left it that way." She started to close the door, to shut me out, just like my mother, just like Mark, just like the world had tried to do all night. But this time was different. I was ready. "She left me this," I said, opening my palm. The small brass key lay there, glinting under the pale porch light. "Eleanor's." Her eyes locked onto it, the fight drained out of her face, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. The hand on the door fell to her side. She looked from the key to my face, and for the first time, she truly saw me, not just as a specter of her sister, but as something new, a messenger. Without another word, she stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. The air in the house was cool and smelled of dust and dried lavender. It was meticulously tidy but utterly devoid of life, a museum of one. She led me through the silent living room to a small study at the back of the house. Against the far wall, beneath a window looking out onto the dark, tangled garden, sat a heavy, dark wood chest bound with iron straps. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, a sarcophagus of secrets. She stopped a few feet from it and turned to me, her expression unreadable. She simply nodded toward the chest, a silent command. This was my window, my choice. I could turn around, leave the key on the table, and walk back out into the night, leaving the ghosts to their slumber. Or I could open it. I walked to the chest and knelt before it. The lock was as ornate as the key, a small, intricate piece of brass tarnished with age. My hand was shaking again, but not from fear. It was anticipation. I looked back at Eleanor. She stood like a statue, her arms crossed, waiting for the verdict of the past. I slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a deep breath that felt like it was drawn from the very bottom of my soul, I turned it. There was a loud, resonant click that broke 50 years of silence. I lifted the heavy lid. The air that rose from the chest was not the musty scent of simple age, but the dry, sharp fragrance of paper and regret. Inside, it was not a jumble of forgotten trinkets, but a space of immense order. On one side lay 2 thick stacks of letters, each bundle tied with a faded silk ribbon, one pale blue, the other a soft cream. On the other side, resting alone on the dark wood, was a small, tarnished silver box, no bigger than my palm. My fingers went to the letters first. I lifted the cream-colored bundle. The handwriting on the top envelope was achingly familiar, the perfect looping script of my grandmother. The letter was addressed to Eleanor. I looked at the postmark. It was dated 51 years ago, but it had never been stamped. It was never sent. I lifted the other bundle, the one tied in blue. The script was spikier, more angular, but just as elegant. To my sister, the top one read, it was from Eleanor to my grandmother, also unsent. A silent, 50-year conversation of rage and sorrow, frozen in ink. Eleanor made a small, choked sound behind me, a knot of air escaping her throat. I didn't look back. My attention was captured by the silver box. It was engraved with a delicate pattern of vines, and on the lid, a single initial, A. Not for Eleanor, for my grandmother, Alice. I lifted the lid. There was no jewelry, no coin, no precious stone. There was only a single, folded document, yellowed and brittle at the creases, a birth certificate. I unfolded it carefully, my breath catching in my chest. The child's name was Daniel. The date of birth was 51 years ago. The place of birth was a private hospital in a neighboring state I'd never heard of. In the space for the mother's name, it read Eleanor Sinclair. The space for the father's name was empty. The truth hit me not like a wave, but like the sudden, shocking absence of gravity. A child, a son. My great aunt had a son. They sent me away. Eleanor's voice was a ghost in the room, thin and stretched across 5 decades of silence. Our parents, your grandparents. They couldn't have the shame. A daughter of their standing, unmarried. She trailed off, her voice cracking on the word. Alice wanted me to fight them. She wanted to run away with me, help me raise him. She said we could manage. She was always the brave one. I finally turned to look at her. She was no longer a statue of severity. Her shoulders were slumped, her face crumpled with a grief so old it seemed carved into her bones. I was the coward, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the certificate in my hands. I was so scared. I let them do it. I let them send me away, and I let them give him away. The quarrel, it wasn't one fight. It was a year of fighting. Alice called me a coward and a fool. I called her a naive dreamer who didn't understand the ruin he would bring down on us all. Her voice broke. The last thing I ever said to her in anger was that she was pointless, that her hope was pointless. Pointless. The word was a punch to the gut, the same word Mark had used, the same word my mother's practicality implied. It was the family curse, the weapon they used to kill anything that was fragile and full of hope. When it was done, Eleanor continued, wrapping her arms around herself, when I came home empty, Alice and I made a pact. We would never speak of it again. We would quell the quarrel by burying it completely. It was the only way we could still be sisters. I looked from her shattered face to the contents of the chest, and I finally understood. My grandmother hadn't just left me a puzzle. She had hedged her bet against oblivion. She had honored her promise to Eleanor, locking the secret away. But she couldn't bear for Daniel to be erased forever. So she built a second lock, a more complicated one that only a person with the patience to listen to a pointless old machine could ever hope to open. The hesitant key wasn't broken. It was a question mark, a prompt to question quietly. The phantom ampersand wasn't a glitch. It was a pointer, the answer to find the and. The typewriter wasn't a boat anchor. It was a life raft for a lost story. I carefully refolded the birth certificate and placed it back in its silver box. I stood up and walked over to my great aunt, who flinched as I approached. I didn't hug her. The chasm between us was too wide for that. Instead, I held out the small brass key. She didn't think you were a coward, I said, my voice thick but clear. She just didn't want you to be alone with it forever. Eleanor stared at the key, then slowly, with a trembling hand that betrayed her age, she reached out and took it from my palm. Her fingers closed around it, a final, quiet acceptance. The 50-year-old silence was broken. The quarrel was, at long last, quelled. My legs felt hollow as I walked away from Eleanor's house, the cool night air doing nothing to calm the tremor in my hands. The adrenaline that had propelled me across the city, that had sharpened my words and steadied my nerve, was gone. In its place was a vast, ringing emptiness. The world felt muffled, distant. I stood under one of the ancient, looming oaks and pulled out my phone, looking at the picture I'd taken of the birth certificate. Daniel Sinclair. A name, a person, a ghost-given form. The whole night replayed in my head a frantic, disjointed film. Mark's hands on me, the sickening crash of the Admiral, the dismissive smirk on the police officer's face. Ma'am, you're saying you want to file a report because your brother dropped this? My mother's desperate plea, Eleanor's wall of grief. A 50-year conspiracy of silence, enforced by shame and fear, and that one, brutal word, pointless. A new feeling began to coalesce in the emptiness. It wasn't the hot rage of before. It was cold, hard, and perfectly clear. They had all tried to silence me, to make me small, to make my truth into a nuisance. The system I had appealed to had sided with them, patting me on the head and telling me to calm down. They were all wrong. I didn't go to a bus stop. I walked to the end of the quiet street, my steps deliberate, and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the contacts for Mark and my mother. Then I swiped past them and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? My voice was calm, devoid of the frantic energy they'd heard before. I need to file a formal complaint against 2 officers and amend a report regarding a domestic assault and destruction of property from earlier this evening. I gave the dispatcher my name and address. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Are you in a safe location, ma'am? I am now, I said. I'll meet the responding officers at the apartment. The cab ride back was silent. I watched my own reflection in the window, and for the first time, I didn't see a girl playing with a pointless toy. I saw a woman who had unearthed a life. When I walked up the stairs to my apartment, the door was ajar. I pushed it open. Mark and my mother were sitting on the couch, their postures stiff with waiting. They both shot to their feet when they saw me. Clara, oh thank God, my mother began, rushing toward me. I held up a single hand and she stopped dead. Mark looked pale, his face etched with a guilt that was, for once, not about getting caught. The police are on their way, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. What? Mark's voice was a croak. Clara, why? I told you I was sorry. I'll pay for it. You can't, I said quietly, just as the sound of heavy footsteps came up the stairs. It was them, the same 2 officers. The man's face was a mask of pure annoyance. The woman looked tired. Ma'am, the man began, his voice already dripping with condescension. We have actual emergencies to deal with. We told you this was a family matter. You told me I was hysterical over an antique. I cut him off, my voice like ice. I took a step toward them, forcing them to focus on me. You saw a woman who was emotional and a man who was calm, and you made a judgment. You didn't listen. You didn't do your job. The officer's jaw tightened. Watch your tone, miss. No, I said, taking another step. You watch mine. That antique you nudged with your boot was a vessel. My grandmother, Alice, designed it to hold a key to a 50-year-old secret. A secret about a child, a baby boy who was given away because of the shame this family couldn't bear. I glanced at my mother, who looked like she might faint. I looked at Mark, whose face was ashen. My brother didn't just drop a typewriter. He assaulted me and tried to destroy the only map my grandmother left behind, the only way to quell a quarrel that destroyed 2 sisters and erased a man's existence. He tried to silence me, and when I came to you for help, you tried to silence me too. I stared directly into the male officer's eyes. I wasn't hysterical. I was right. The property he destroyed wasn't just valuable. It was the only thing in the world that held the truth. Now, I have the evidence to prove it. So you have 2 choices. You can take my official statement for the assault and the destruction of irreplaceable property, and you can give me your badge numbers for the complaint I'll be filing with your supervisor. Or you can leave, and I will start my complaint with the fact that you refused to take a domestic assault report not once, but twice. What's it going to be? The air crackled. The officer's smug certainty had vanished, replaced by a dawning horror. He had misjudged the situation completely, and he knew it. He exchanged a look with his partner. The condescension was gone from her face, too. She just looked at me, really looked at me, and nodded, almost imperceptibly. She pulled out her notepad. The sound of the cheap paper flipping was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Okay, ma'am, she said, her voice now clipped and professional. Let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything. My statement was a clinical dissection of the night. I laid out the facts, one by one, my voice a monotone instrument of record. The shove. The theft of the typewriter. The crash. The officer's initial dismissal. The discovery of the key. The visit to Eleanor's. The contents of the chest. I omitted nothing. The female officer wrote it all down, her pen scratching a frantic rhythm in the suffocating silence of the apartment. Mark stood by the far wall, looking at the floor, his shoulders hunched in a way I'd never seen before. My mother sat on the edge of the couch, twisting her hands in her lap, her face a pale, drawn mask. When it was over, the officers left, their professionalism a thin, brittle shield against the mess they were leaving behind. The door clicked shut, and the three of us remained frozen in our tableau of ruin. My mother was the first to break. "Clara," she whispered, her voice ragged. "We need to talk." "No," I said, the word coming out as a dry rasp. "We don't. There's nothing left to say." I walked back to my room. The body of the Admiral was still on the floor where it had fallen. The crime scene. The sight of it made my stomach clench. The beautiful black enamel, now a fractured mess. The proud, upright G type bar that had seemed so accusatory before now just looked broken, pathetic. I felt a wave of nausea. This machine, my secret friend, my co-conspirator, was now just a casualty. Its voice was gone. The satisfying clack-clack ding was replaced in my memory by the sickening final crash. The thought of ever touching it again, of trying to fix it, felt like a violation. Its purpose was served, and the cost was its own life. It wasn't a monument anymore, it was a tombstone. I closed the door on it, on them, and fell onto my bed, my clothes still on. Exhaustion pulled at me like a physical weight, but sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The typewriter falling in slow motion, the spider web of cracks spreading across its surface. But other images crowded in too. Eleanor's face, collapsing after 50 years of stoicism. The phantom name on a yellowed certificate. Daniel. A man who existed only as a secret. My secret now. My burden. The weight of his life, of his loss, settled into my bones. The victory I had felt in the police station curdled into a profound, hollow ache. I had won, so why did I feel like I had lost everything? Hours later, a soft knock came at my door. I didn't answer. "Clara?" It was Mark. His voice was choked, unfamiliar. I can't sleep. I keep hearing it. The sound it made when it hit the floor. A long pause. "I see your face. When I pushed you." He sounded like he was crying. "I'm so sorry. It's not about the money or the machine. It's what I did. I was so ugly, so pointless." He used the word, the family curse, but he turned it on himself. I heard him slide down to the floor on the other side of the door, his quiet, shuddering breaths, a muffled counterpoint to the ringing in my own ears. I didn't have the strength to comfort him. I didn't have the words. He had broken more than just a typewriter. He had broken us. My quest for the truth had not healed a family wound. It had merely lanced it, and now we were all drowning in the poison that had come out. I didn't open the door. I lay there and listened to his ragged breaths until they faded into the oppressive silence of the apartment. Sleep never came. Morning arrived not with light, but with a cessation of darkness, a gray, washed-out gloom that matched the landscape of my own heart. When I finally emerged from my room, the apartment was still. My mother was asleep on the couch, a crumpled tissue in her hand. Mark was nowhere to be seen. The door to his room was closed. My phone rang, its buzz unnaturally loud. It wasn't Mark or my mother. The caller ID was a blocked number. I answered, my voice a dry croak. "Is this Clara?" The voice was male, professional, and tired. "Yes. This is Sergeant Miller with the city police. I'm supervising the officers who responded to your calls last night. I've reviewed their initial report and your subsequent statement. I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to come down to the station to make a formal complaint with Internal Affairs, today if possible." He wasn't asking. He was telling me that my threat had landed. The system was stirring, trying to get ahead of the damage. "I'll be there in an hour," I said and hung up. Getting ready felt like moving through water. I had to pass the typewriter again. I knelt beside it, my fingers tracing the sharp, new edges of the cracks. The gay G key was still standing at attention. I gently pushed it back down into the basket of type bars. It settled with a soft, defeated click. It wasn't a tombstone. It was a casualty of war. I stood up, leaving it there on the floor, a monument to the cost of truth. I walked out of the apartment without a word. The station was a sterile brick building that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was the same building where my truth had been dismissed as hysterics just hours before. This time, I wasn't brought to a waiting area. I was led directly to a small, windowless office. Sergeant Miller was a heavy-set man with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. The female officer from last night, whose name I now knew was Officer Evans, was there too. She sat in a corner, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the table. The male officer was absent. "Ms. Bell," Sergeant Miller began, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for coming in. Officer Evans has corroborated the details of your amended statement. I'm here to formally apologize on behalf of the department. Your initial call was mishandled. Profoundly." I just looked at him, my hands folded on the table in front of me. I didn't want an apology, I wanted acknowledgement. "The officer in question," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "made a judgment call based on his own biases, not on procedure. He saw a family argument, not a potential assault. He has been placed on administrative duty pending a full investigation." I finally spoke, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of the whole night. He didn't just make a judgment call, he actively invalidated me. He decided my fear was an overreaction and my property was worthless. He made me the problem. I looked over at Officer Evans, who finally met my gaze. There was shame in her eyes. "You both did." "I know," Sergeant Miller said, "and that's the core of this complaint. It's not just about a broken typewriter, Ms. Bell. It's about our failure to listen. We're recording this statement now. I need you to tell me, in your own words, what was at stake. Why was that machine so important?" This was it, the moment to make them understand. "That machine," I began, leaning forward slightly, "was a promise my grandmother made to her sister 50 years ago. It was a lockbox for a family secret so painful it broke them both. The key to that lock was hidden inside the machine itself, accessible only through a series of puzzles she designed. My brother didn't just break an antique. He almost destroyed the only existing key to a man's life. A man who was given up for adoption and erased from my family's history. When your officer nudged it with his boot and called it junk, he was standing on a man's grave." The room was utterly still. Sergeant Miller stared at me, the practiced bureaucratic mask gone from his face. Officer Evans had her hand over her mouth. "I came to you for help," I finished, my voice dropping to a near whisper, because I was scared and because something precious had been violated. "And you told me to calm down. You sided with the aggressor because he seemed more reasonable than the hysterical woman. Your job is to protect, but you don't get to decide who or what is worthy of that protection. You failed. And that failure almost cost my family its last chance at redemption." Sergeant Miller was silent for a long time. He nodded slowly. "Your complaint is more than validated, Ms. Bell. It's necessary. The charges against your brother for assault and destruction of property are being filed. In this incident, it will be used as a training case for the entire precinct. I give you my word on that. Systemic change. It wasn't a revolution. It was a single file in a single office that would now carry the weight of my story. A case file that would teach other officers not to dismiss a woman's fear as pointless." I left the station and walked out into the cold, bright sun. The air felt clean. The world didn't feel muffled anymore. It was sharp and clear. I hadn't fixed my family. I hadn't found Daniel. But I had taken the dismissive, condescending power that had been used against me, and I had handed it back. I had forced the system to look at its own reflection, and for the first time, I felt like I could finally breathe. 2 months. That's how long it had been since my world cracked open. The first few weeks were a blur of legal formalities. Mark pleaded guilty to misdemeanor destruction of property. The assault charge was dropped as part of the deal, a concession that left a bitter taste in my mouth until my therapist helped me reframe it. "It's not forgiveness," she'd said, her voice calm and even. "It's triage. You stopped the bleeding. Now you get to heal." Mark moved out. He was paying restitution and attending his own court-mandated therapy. We hadn't spoken, but last week, a A check had arrived in the mail with a single, scrawled sentence on the memo line, "For the Admiral." My mother and I orbited each other in a cold, polite silence. The truth I'd unearthed was a sun that had burned too brightly, and now she could only look at me through squinted eyes, unable to face the glare. Our calls were about the weather, about groceries. We never spoke of Eleanor. Eleanor and I, however, wrote to each other. Tentative, weekly letters, sent through the mail. We didn't talk about the 50 years of silence. We talked about her overgrown rose bushes, and I sent her a book on pruning. She told me she'd hired a private investigator. We were looking for Daniel. There was no guarantee, no promise of a happy ending. There was only the quiet, shared act of looking. Today, I reclaimed my space. I had spent the morning moving every piece of furniture in my room. My desk now sat in the very center of the main wall, no longer relegated to a corner, and on it, where my laptop used to be, sat the Admiral KMM. It was still broken. I had cleaned it piece by piece, but the deep spiderweb of cracks in the enamel remained, and the frame was still fractured from the impact. For weeks, I couldn't touch it without feeling a phantom echo of the crash, of Mark's hands on my shoulders. But now, it looked different. The cracks weren't a sign of its death. They were scars, proof of what it had survived. I had spent a month reading books on metalwork and typewriter repair. I'd bought a small kit of jeweler's files and a special epoxy resin mixed with brass powder. The Japanese call it kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, celebrating the damage as part of an object's history. My version was humbler, an attempt not to erase the violence but to honor the wound. I sat at the desk and laid out my tools on a soft cloth. My hands were steady. I wasn't trying to make it work again, not yet. I was just trying to make it whole. I carefully applied the brass-filled epoxy into the largest crack, my finger tracing the jagged line, smoothing the resin until it filled the void. It wasn't black enamel. It would never be the same. It would be a thin, golden scar. There was no satisfying clack-clack ding. There was only the soft scrape of my tools, the quiet whisper of my own breathing. The machine had given up its great secret, its voice sacrificed to tell its most important story. Now it was my turn to care for it, to tend to its silence. I was no longer listening for a message hidden in its mechanics. I was giving something back. It wasn't a monument to a forgotten age or a tombstone for a family secret. It was just mine, and it was no longer pointless. Nothing I loved would ever be pointless again. The cracks in the enamel were a roadmap of the night my life broke open. I traced them with my finger, the thin golden lines of brass-infused resin I'd so carefully applied. It was a new kind of map, one that didn't lead to a secret, but one that showed the way back. My way back. The typewriter would never be the same. The satisfying clack-clack ding was gone, replaced by a profound and dignified silence. It had told its most important story, and its voice had been the price. My relationships were fractured too. Mark and I exchanged terse, necessary texts about the restitution payments. My mother called once a week to talk about the weather. We were all practicing our own form of kintsugi, filling the gaps between us not with gold, but with a cautious, fragile silence. Only with Eleanor did the silence break. Our weekly letters were a slow, careful reconstruction of a bridge that had collapsed 50 years ago. We were partners now, 2 generations of Sinclair women looking for a ghost named Daniel. The investigator she'd hired had a promising lead, a man with the right age and birth location living just a few states over. There was no guarantee, but for the first time in half a century, there was hope. I finished smoothing the last line of resin and stood back, looking at my work. The Admiral KMM sat in the center of my room, its black body now laced with a delicate, shining web of gold. It wasn't broken anymore. It was healed. The scars weren't a mark of its ruin. They were a testament to its strength. It had held a life in its gears, a truth in its keys, and it had survived the violence of being silenced, just like me. The machine's purpose wasn't to type anymore. Its purpose now was to sit in the light, to bear its scars without shame, and to remind me that some things, a grandmother's love, a sister's grief, a woman's voice, are never, ever pointless. My story isn't over. Not really. It's just beginning. And if you want to be part of what comes next, to see if we find him, make sure you like and subscribe, because this journey is far from finished.